Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon if you're in the US. Welcome to today's webinar. It's the fourth and also the last in our series of webinars. I'm Hannah Brown. I'm the Marketing Director in the London office at M3, and I'm joined by Tom Pugh, who's one of the Business Development Directors in the UK. Thanks for joining us today and for your interest in gamification, its relevance to the healthcare market research industry specifically. I'll hand over to Tom shortly, and he'll be sharing his thoughts, no doubt, on using Space Invaders to lighten the mood on PRFs. We'll be taking questions at the end, but you can submit them at any time during the webinar. You should, on the right hand of your screen, see a Q&A and chat function. You can send messages, technical problems or questions that you want to ask Tom or I during the webinar, and we'll get to them at the end. So first, a few words about our speaker today. Tom Pugh joined us as a Business Development Director in 2017 and specialises in real-world data and innovation in online tracking. He's worked in international fieldwork since 2010, holding senior sales roles at major organisations, whilst also fostering his entrepreneurship in setting up and subsequently selling an online media business. And if you joined us for the patient webinar, you'll remember that online media business involved webinars. So he's really one of our experts in the business. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Hannah. I think expert on webinars would be stretching it, but thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are across the globe. It's great to see such strong numbers again attending one of our webinars. We've thoroughly enjoyed running them this summer. And it's great to see our clients attending in such good numbers, so thank you. I'm going to talk to everyone today about, well, essentially gamification. So if I had like a pound or a dollar for every time I'd been at a conference or I've been in a client meeting and we discuss gamification and how appropriate a term it is for healthcare or medical market research, then I'd be a very rich man. It's not a new term, it's something we've been discussing for a few years now. And ultimately, you know, it comes back to the concept that what we all do for a job is we collect and we analyse and we provide insights on pretty serious information. It's by definition quite clinical, and the concept of how appropriate gamification is as a term gets brought up fairly regularly. So what we're actually going to talk about is another word. Now, unfortunately, it's a word that I struggle to say and I've been practicing non-stop for the last 3 days, but here we go. We're going to talk about revivification, which basically, essentially, it stems from the Latin, where essentially means to kind of breathe life into, to add energy, to add spirit. And when we're looking at the limited universe sizes that we all work with, you know, surveying doctors or any kind of healthcare respondent, they're always a niche within a niche of society. This seems a far more appropriate term. Our respondents, like all respondents, are taking part in surveys on a reasonably regular basis, and essentially it's very serious subject matter. But I want us today to look at, if we don't think gamification is a wholly appropriate term, what can we do with our current survey design to make it slightly more creative, more engaging, and to basically have a bit more empathy for the respondent. Now, this isn't a case of just enhancing the experience to make it more enjoyable for the respondent. It's also a case of enhancing the experience to then enhance the quality of captured data that you as our clients will receive, and ultimately that the end pharma client will have their insights derived from. So it should be wins all round, essentially. For me, what's really important about what we've looked at today is the fact that this isn't, the ideas we're going to come forward with, they're not ideas that should cost any more budget. They shouldn't, you know, add any length to timelines. Again, I've seen briefs over the years where the end client has asked for something a little bit innovative, and by the time they get the RFP back with the field work and the research and proposal, you know, programming timelines are double what they should be, and that cost has gone up. It's not about that. It's about quick wins. It's about looking at the content we're providing to the niches that we survey, to challenge them, to be a bit more creative, a bit more engaging, and to, as I say, to drive a better quality of data. So For those of you that know M3 well, and I hope that's most people on the call, you'll hopefully know that one of the things we do quite extensively is conduct research on research. Understanding for us what drives engagement of physicians, I'm sure you can imagine, is hugely important. The more engaged our panels are, our physicians are, the more responsive they are to the surveys that we pass their way. And as I said, the better quality of data. So it's always in our interest to understand engagement. So we run fairly regular projects where we'll go out to the panel and we'll survey what they like, what they don't like, what their thoughts are, what they would change. And it's been very successful for us. What we did here for this particular piece of research is we ran a pulse survey. So I think it was 2 to 3 minutes in length, no more than five questions really. We went out to a pretty big sample size, so 846 physicians across the EU5 and the US, spread across secondary and primary care, and in secondary care, a nice smattering across all your main therapy areas and specialty groups. What's really important about looking at the sampling here is we only went out to respondents that we would consider experienced market research respondents. So the average experience in terms of participating in primary market research here is 8 years. What that means is these respondents have been with us, as track has moved from face-to-face to online. They've seen the advent of mobile within healthcare. They've taken part in surveys over a period of time. So they're a really good eclectic group that we can derive responses from to basically see how they think we're doing as an industry in terms of engaging them, limiting their frustrations, and making them more likely to come back and take part in market research surveys. And ultimately, what we all need as an industry is respondents to come back and take part in market research studies. So what we did is we started off by asking them to what extent they agreed with 7 statements about the research they're currently receiving. So as I say, bear in mind, these aren't, virgin participants. These are people that have got a lot of historical context in terms of the surveys they've been receiving. So what I'm going to do as a first off, we're just going to go through those 7 statements, but then more importantly, spend a little bit more time on what that data actually means. So the next kind of few slides should move fairly quickly, and we'll go into a bit more depth at the end of that phase. So the first thing we asked them is what percentage of physicians agree that better survey design keeps you engaged? And not surprisingly, nearly 80% said, yeah, it does keep me a lot more engaged, which is important. Now, that might seem quite an obvious piece of data, but it's crucial there that we know that if we do spend more time collectively trying to engage these respondents, then it's only going to be positive. It shows that respondents are noticing how good our survey design is, or how good they perceive it to be. So ultimately, it's really crucial that that survey design is kept in mind if we are trying to push for better data. The second thing we asked of them is what percentage of physicians agree that overall their survey experience has improved. So again, nearly 3/4 think it is improving, which I guess we can pat ourselves on the back for that as an industry. That's a high number. It's good. I mean, given the technology we have to hand and the experience we all have now, it would be massively disappointing if that figure was lower. So we shouldn't get too carried away. But again, when we went out to do this pulse survey, we were pleasantly surprised with how strong the data was, how positive it was for these 2 attributes. So the third thing we asked of them is what percentage of physicians agree that online surveys have become more user-friendly? So, again, it's fairly positive, but we're starting to drop off a little bit more now. And given all the tools we have to hand, we get to that stage, I think, where we can flip it on its head. And that means 28% think that surveys aren't becoming more user-friendly, which, I suggest is a bit of a concern. I would have expected that number to be slightly higher, to be honest with you. So the fourth thing we asked, which I think is quite interesting, We asked what percentage of physicians agree that the clarity of survey questions has improved. So we're at 68% now. Personally speaking, again, we're above 50%, but I don't think that's that high. If we're collectively getting respondents, highly educated people to take time out of their schedules to take part in our market research surveys, and 32% feel that we're actually not, getting better at asking questions, we're not getting any clearer over time, we're not demonstrating learning, then that's something that we really need to have a look at. If I'm a physician, I've got half an hour between appointments and I'm sitting there and I can't understand what it is I'm being asked. That's clearly going to drive drop out of surveys, and chances are that physician might not come back for a time. So again, this is something we need to have a look at. Next, we asked what percentage of physicians agree that surveys have become more interesting. So you can see the trend now. We're starting to go down and down gradually. So 35% of respondents feel that they're not becoming more interesting, which again I would cite as a concern. So we've just got 2 more to go. So the next one was what percentage of physicians feel that their participation feels more valued, and we're at 63% now. So again, I feel we are really dropping off. As mentioned, previously these are highly intelligent respondents. They are particularly time poor, and only 63% feel that over time their participation feels more valued. So again, something that we need to address. But the final attribute we asked here, I think is probably for me, I think is maybe the most damning. We're down to 56%, and this is what percentage of physicians agree that they experience fewer frustrations when participating. And that, for me, that is a worry, that 44% of physicians feel that we're not getting any better collectively at limiting the frustrations they feel when they take part in market research surveys. As mentioned at the top of the webinar, we work in a niche. We work with small universes. We're not working, in consumer as an industry. We're working with a very select number of people. And if we see drop-offs, in like UK dermatologists as an example, then that's going to be really hard for us to re-engage those respondents down the line. So that piece of data alone, I think, of the 7 attributes for me, is the one that when we saw it, that became a particular concern. So summarising these data points, I mean, essentially, every attribute was scored better than 50%. And to me, when we set out to do this, and then we saw the data, that was surprising. We thought it was going to come back much lower. So actually, that was really encouraging for us to see. So the consensus is pretty positive, I guess. But as I say, if you flip it on its head and look at those that don't think we're improving, it's still a pretty high number. And given the fact that there's like 1,100 UK oncologists as an example, I just think it's a call to action. Really, we need to make sure that 44% of those oncologists aren't experiencing the same frustrations moving forward. So for me, I think this shows that collectively we're doing okay. We could be doing a lot better. And actually, what's really important today is it's not about moving the needle too far. We're not talking about absolutely ripping up the rule book and starting all over again. We're talking about addressing a few choice areas pretty quickly that we think will alleviate a lot of frustrations, leaving participations feeling valued and challenged and fully engaged, coming back to take part in surveys and delivering our clients as rich a data as possible. So I think what's really important now is we have a look at which types of surveys can this impact the most, but also, most important, what are the takeaways from today that we can all start implementing together tomorrow? So for me, the next slide, looking at where this can impact the most, I think this is incredibly powerful. We asked physicians to rank their most preferred type of survey, and they could rank their first and second choice, and we grouped together surveys into kind of broad categories. And I think the data that came out was for me was fascinating. I mean, if you look at the number one, new product research, so 68% of physicians feel that new product research is either their first or their second favourite type of market research to take part in. And when we think about it, that's not a huge surprise. So we did a paper a couple of years ago looking at what drives engagement, and at the top of the tree, again, it won't be a huge surprise that physicians don't do this for free. They get paid an incentive, and incentives will always, I imagine, drive engagement. But actually, one of the things that really drives engagement is being able to learn something new, the sharing of knowledge, and that kind of intellectual curiosity that, if you're a HCP and you've gone through many years of med school and university, and you never really stop learning. They're always reading journals or interacting or trying to further the knowledge. New product research gives them exactly that. There might be a chance to review a TPP or to have a look at what's coming down the line into how they're going to be treating a certain disease in the future. So the fact that they get an incentive for that research, but also they learn something, they see something new, it's no surprise that that's top of the tree here. But if we look at two that are much lower down, that I think are really pertinent to where we are at the moment as an industry, if you take GDPR to one side, probably the biggest buzz phrase at a conference is patient centricity. We've just done our own webinar on patient market research, and it is much discussed. Patient record form studies, certainly for us, and I think across the industry, have only increased as patient centricity has become more and more central. And the fact that only 18% of physicians think it's their favourite or their second favourite, for me, I wouldn't say it's damning, but it shows the challenge that we have. If we go back to the initial point of gamification, I think it's pretty clear that it's very difficult to, take a consumer angle and gamify a patient record form. It is extremely clinical in what we're asking the physician to record. But if we look at revivification, it'd be interesting to see what we could do within the patient record form to further engage physicians, how we could set it out to make it a bit more challenging, a bit more interesting. Because ultimately we need physicians to be completing these studies, to be engaged, to be driving good data, and come back and do it again and again. Likewise, if you look at pricing survey, sat right at the bottom, only 10% of physicians have that as their first or second choice. You think about the world economy, the pressure on government, certainly across Europe, with the healthcare spend. You look at the pipelines that various drug companies have of biosimilar products. And pricing surveys, again, are on the increase. So it's what can we do within pricing surveys to limit frustration, to better engage respondents, to make sure that these are being completed and completed in robust numbers to deliver insights to the end pharma client. So that's kind of where we are, the challenge, I guess, the thinking behind it and the data behind it. But ultimately, what are we going to do now? What we want to do really is put forward some ideas that we can adopt immediately. Tomorrow on your market research studies with your fieldwork agency, with your clients, that we'll have a bit more empathy towards the end user and keep them engaged. What's really important here, I can't stress this enough, is we're not talking about massive innovation here. We're not talking about huge gamified techniques. The whole point of this presentation is about breathing life into the studies that we're currently running, but making sure they're not cartoonized, they're not inappropriate, making sure that the doctor doesn't feel patronized in any way. So some of these ideas are pretty straightforward, but the data behind them suggests that they could have an immediate impact. So the first of these is incredibly simple. 77% of physicians simply want to know where they are in the survey. I mean, if you think about it, I completed an online form myself recently, for I think it was for a driving license or something, and the form seemed to go on forever, But in the corner of the screen, I was constantly being told that I was like 75%, I was 80% of the way there. And you think, well, yeah, okay, this is, hopefully our service is a lot more interesting than filling out one of those forms. But at the same time, you get to a stage where you think, well, I'm getting near the end now. I'll sit it out. I'll make myself a drink and I'll see this through and get there. And I think for a lot of our physicians, they enter into a survey with a strong idea of how long it's going to be take. They'll know it's a 30-minute online questionnaire. And if they're kind of like 22 minutes through and they can't see the end in sight, or if it isn't the most engaging, and hopefully the other ideas will ensure that doesn't happen, at least them knowing how much further they've got to go so they can see the finish line is actually pretty important. And 77%, it's a big number. That's over 3/4 of physicians would really benefit from that. So again, it's not, this isn't really a gamify technique in any way. It's just a way of expressing empathy for the end user and making it a bit easier for them, to be honest with you. The second piece of advice here, and I think this probably won't surprise a lot of people on the webinar, is the number of attributes that are provided in one question and restricting that really. I've seen some data over time, and not just in healthcare, but across kind of consumer and automotive, that shows, when you have huge grid questions of attributes, it's very quick to lose the respondents' interest. And, that isn't going to drive the highest quality of data that I know, we all strive for. So trying to limit those attributes, trying to make it a bit more interactive, maybe finding another way of programming it. And this is where, regardless of whether your fieldwork agency is M3 or someone else, your programmer, whether you could be programming this yourself, need to have a look at how we display attribute questions. How do we make it less daunting, really? How do you make it a bit more interesting? And I think the simplest way is to try and limit the attributes to one question. Now, I appreciate there'll be people on the webinar that have had trackers that have run for years, or will feel that they have to include a load of attributes because that meets multiple research objectives with one project. And I understand that. I do understand the constraints everyone operates within, but I just think it's one of those things that when we're sat down looking at a questionnaire, if we can keep in mind that nearly 60% of physicians have said, hey, if you could limit the amount of attributes, that would be great and I'd really enjoy it, then I think we're taking a step in the right direction. So, we spoke earlier that, a decent number of physicians, kind of over 35%, felt that, questionnaires weren't getting any easier to understand. And, I was saying that if you've got a physician and they're taking part in a project and they're not, fully sure what they're being asked, then clearly it's a waste opportunity to tap into someone's brain. So simplifying question content, simplified language and wording, we're over 50% here, so it's 61% would like to see simplify the question content, 53% would like to see language and wording simplified. Again, they're over half. So clearly there's something we can do there collectively to improve that. By that definition, over half are at some point sitting there thinking, I'm not overly sure what I'm being asked here. So, when we sit down to write questionnaires, when we program them, obviously this is something to look at. If timelines and budget allow, I know they don't always do, this is where piloting is such a great tool to do. Running a pilot in, assuming there's obviously people here in the US or Europe, in some English-speaking markets, can always be pretty quick. I have a number of clients that do this and moderate themselves, and asking respondents, did you understand question 7? Did you understand what we were looking for? Was it clear? And the physician comes back and says, well, actually, I wasn't too sure. That's great. That's the chance to improve the wording and make it more clear. So I think that's a very, very straightforward thing for us to be looking into. So over half for the next attribute, 52% are seeking a more interactive experience. So they are actively putting the ball in our court to say, make this more interactive, make this more exciting, more dynamic. we have a lot of really creative people in this industry, and I think that's really laying down the gauntlet to us. What can we do? And I haven't got the answer now. I think it'll be different on each quantitative project, but I just think, given the fact you've got that kind of captive audience taking part in your survey, it'd be really interesting to see what we can do to make things interactive. Programming has come a long way since we all started out doing online market research, and that, the balls in our court as a fieldwork agency as well here. When we're sat on that kickoff call with our clients and our programmers, what can we be suggesting or discussing with our clients in terms of, making a grid question, more dynamic and more exciting. So on to the next attribute. 47% of respondents would love to see visualization questions in place of text-heavy questions. So just under half now, so we're moving away from the majority. But again, that's a pretty big number. And I think that's quite interesting, because if I'm a physician and I'm 45 minutes into a survey, and I get to, I don't know, like question 63 or something, and it's all heavy text and it's 3 paragraphs, it's a lot to take in when I've been concentrating for a long time already. So I think, and obviously there will be instances where you can't get away from text, I completely appreciate that. But I think where that text can be text plus an infographic, or text plus a visual, or text plus some diagrams, or just something that makes it more engaging. Like a picture really can speak 1,000 words. And we do see a lot of text-heavy questionnaires. I just wonder from there, can we just be challenging ourselves to try and incorporate visuals a lot more? Now, again, I appreciate what we do is very serious subject matter. It's far easier, I think, in consumer research to do this. But are we doing enough in healthcare and pharmaceuticals? And I would suggest we probably could be doing more. I think we just have one more of these. So 38%. So again, now we're coming down. We're less than 2 in 5 people. But 38% think we could do a lot more to improve fonts and colours. Now, again, that might seem quite a touchy-feely kind of fairly frivolous suggestion. But again, a vibrant-looking survey, within reason, it has to be appropriate, of course. But something with a bit more vibrancy is always going to be a bit more engaging and uplifting than something that is, is quite plain and is quite sterile. So I think we can look at that. We have to temper this. I mean, we can never have a scenario where you have a ridiculous number of fonts and, a ridiculous color scheme, and it completely trivializes the whole exercise. But again, it's something we should be looking at. And, this falls into fieldwork agencies' courts as well. What are we doing on the programming side to make our surveys more visually appealing? So this is really the summary slide, but as I said at the top of this webinar, gamification itself, it's probably not as appropriate as it can be in other industries. And what we're really looking at is revivification. And what we want today is stuff that people can take away and execute now. So we've kind of got 5 sections here that I'll go through very quickly, but it's really summarising what we've already said. A strong number of respondents, they just want to have an idea of where they are in the survey. It'd be interesting to run the question around frustrations again, if that was incorporated on every project, and to see what the change in the data point would be. But just keeping respondents updated. We try and manage their expectations up front and how long a survey is going to be. They always want to know if we're going to collectively uphold our side of the bargain. So things like a progress toolbar, simple tools like that give them an idea of how much further they've got to go. If it's a patient record form study, is there a landing page they can go to see, if they've got to do 8 forms, how far are they along? Very simple stuff like that. But I think very powerful. No impact on your budget, no impact on timelines. Just think clear and concise. Meeting them where they are. Having that kind of empathy for the user, really, making sure that it's obvious what we're asking them. We're asking for a commitment of their time. Yes, of course, they get paid an incentive, but we need to respect their time. We need to make them feel valued. And I think, a big part of that is making sure that what we're asking of them, is obvious and they can follow it. taking tips from design thinking, and I think this is really looking at it from the end user point of view, seeing it from their perspective. I'm a big advocate of pre-tests and pilots for online surveys. I understand that we all have deadlines to meet, but if we can get that done in a week and the changes to the questionnaire on the back of it, I just think it's time well spent. And I like the concept then that you're really co-creating a survey with the end respondent. You're asking their peers to feed back into what they liked and didn't like before you go out and get the rest of your quantitative sample. I think that's really important. We talked about visualization. I appreciate, it probably is more difficult to do than it is in consumer, and it's not going to work on every question. And I absolutely think in lots of cases it won't be appropriate. But if we go into creating surveys and programming surveys with this in the back of our mind, that we know that respondents would love stuff to be more visual and less text heavy. And even if we improve by 20, 30%, then that's really great. That's really going to drive engagement and drive better data. So it's just something for us to keep in the back of our mind when we're putting stuff together. And the final point here is something that we haven't really spoken about so much on the webinar, but it's something that I find really interesting, and we wanted to add it in. Is that sometimes by restricting something within a survey, you actually get so much more. So, if I was to ask, a collective of oncologists to name, drugs that are treated to treat ovarian cancer, they might, name one or two, and they might then move on to the next question, because ultimately they might think, well, one or two is enough. It's what comes to mind. Are we really engaged with them? Are we really challenging them in that scenario? I think probably not. I think in that scenario, if we place a limiting factor on it and say, you've got 60 seconds, how many can you name in 60 seconds? Or, we play to their competitive side, like physicians are, in my experience, incredibly competitive. And we say that, in our research, the average oncologist can name 8 ovarian cancer treatments in 60 seconds. How many can you name? I would, I've seen the data previously. I would wager that you will see a lot more than 1 or 2 names. And actually, by limiting it to 60 seconds, you're really engaging them, you're really pushing them, you're really challenging them. And just think about the audience. These are people that love to be challenged. Limiting the words in a question. So again, when we look at open ends and coding, the average number of words for an open end, 6 to 8 maybe. If we, again, challenge the physician and say, in between 50 and 20 words, or in under 20 words, setting the expectation that we think they're going to go up to 20, then again, it's just a neat little pivot on the way questions are currently asked that can really drive the richness of the data that you receive. So nothing on that slide should cost any more budget. It shouldn't take any more time. It's really about quick wins tomorrow, to revive, to kind of breathe life, to re-engage the respondents that we are conducting market research with. So that's it from me. Before I hand over to Hannah, just to say, I'm really looking forward to seeing what questions we have come back. Hannah, I'll hand back over to you good self.
Thank you. So while Tom looks through the questions, I'll take the opportunity to just cover some housekeeping again. Normally at this point I'd be flogging the next webinar, but because it's the last one, that won't be happening. But we do want to run them again, possibly at the beginning of next year. So we'd love to hear any suggestions for topics that we could cover. At the end of the webinar, as with previous ones, you'll be taken to a survey about today's webinar. Please take the time to complete it. We do find the feedback really useful, especially the section that asks for any suggestions for future webinars. We want to make sure that we're covering topics that are important and interesting to you. So any feedback that you can give us in the survey would be great, or drop me an email at any time. Right, so back to the questions. Tom, do you find that there's ever a trade-off between making research smoother, more engaging and enjoyable for respondents versus efficiently getting through the objective questions? That is to say, a choice needing to be made between respondent experience compared to tactical strategic data needs.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and ultimately that's the challenge for us all. That is, in a nutshell, exactly the challenge. you might have a research project where you've got various research objectives. My knowledge of pharmaceutical clients isn't as strong as my knowledge of our own clients, like research agencies and consultancies, but you might have different teams all feeding in, or different affiliates all feeding in, who want very different things. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge for us all, is then putting the respondent front and centre when you've got so many other stakeholders that have got a vested interest. And I think there will always be times where questions are not optimal because of that. But I think as a first step, if we can just sit there and look at questionnaires and just think, how can we make this 20-30% more engaging as a starting point? So not ripping it up and starting again, then I think it's a step in the right direction. The idea behind the summary slide is that it's very, very small things that I don't think, if we employ them tomorrow, should vastly affect research objectives. I could be wrong, but yeah, to that point, it's a very, very difficult trade-off, and I guess it's very easy for me in a way to talk about the theory of it, the practice of it, and the application. That's where the challenge is.
Okay, great. And your next one, would we ever consider asking respondents to rate each survey upon completion on a couple of elements, and then provide our clients with a custom yearly or quarterly report that will allow us to see how engaging our designs are compared to others in the same industry? So I guess benchmarking particular surveys against others.
What a fantastic idea! I'm trying to think off the top of my head what barriers there would be, and once I get off the webinar, I'll have to, I could check with some colleagues, but I can't think of any. I think that would be a really fantastic thing to do. I also think the actual act, the gesture and the goodwill associated with doing that is, I think respondents would really like being asked, how they found it, and what bits they liked, what bits they didn't like, or assessing it. I think that'd be really, really, really interesting. So whoever asked that question, absolutely fantastic idea. I think that would be a really great way forward.
Brilliant. Add it to the to-do list then. I think that's everything we've got time for. It's nearly 22. If you do have any other questions, as ever, send them on to me. My email address is on all the emails from Zoom. We'll send out the full audio and video version of the presentation in the next couple of days, as well as a copy of the slides. And you'll find them and previous webinars in the resources section of the M3 Global Research website. So thanks very much for joining us this evening, this afternoon even, and thank you for joining us for the webinar series this year.